Hello, it's Patricia with another edition of the Haiku podcast. You may have listened to Sean's reading of Fragmentation on episode 11 of the 6th series of the Haiku podcast, which of course is also out on YouTube. If not, I recommend you go and have a listen to that episode before you listen to this. After his reading, Sean stayed on for a little while to answer questions from the audience. It was an audience of poets experienced in the Japanese short form, not exclusively in Haibun though. And of course, they were invited because they were on our mailing list. Do sign up. There will be other events. Now, Sean had no idea what the questions would be, but happily he likes to work off the cuff. Shall we hear what transpired? Sean, you write beautifully, whether you write prose or poetry, but you chose to go down the Haibun route, which, let's face it, it's not the most lucrative of writing forms. And your prose is so wonderful and your books are so well thought out with themes. But I wondered why it was you chose Haibun rather than novels.
So do I. As a matter of fact, I have actually written a novel that's not published. So it's not like I don't write in other forms, and I've certainly written a lot of short stories and in many poetry forms. I think that it depends on what you're writing. I don't think I choose the form. I think the form chooses what I'm trying to write, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have a very long background of writing in Japanese literary forms, so I would tend to orientate to them. But it depends on what I'm doing. That's a very vague answer, isn't it? But it does. So, for example, if you start to write a short story, you could easily find yourself thinking, that this needs to be longer and longer and longer, and eventually you're into a novel. So I like what the Irish writer Claire Keegan says about this. She said that we don't write short or long. We really need to write enough. And enough, according to Claire Keegan, and I agree with her, is not one word too few, too few. So be careful when you're pairing back. You don't pair that one word, that makes it too few, and not one word too long. And that's what we mean by the story has to be enough. I often find a lot of novels when I'm reading them that there's this section I call it the penultimate dead end. There's this part about 30 pages from the end of a book, and then the 30 pages before that are kind of boring. And something has happened in a lot of novels I've read over the years. And it turns out that it's a stylized thing, but the pilgrimage and the way the journeys are. But I don't like any dead wood in any writing at all. So I like writers like Ian McEwan, and it was very tight. And I like people like Claire Keegan and love her work and all of that. So the starting point is not what will I do, but what does the story, or what am I trying to articulate? What does that demand that I do? So I don't start off thinking I'm going to write a load of Haibun. I just end up writing a lot of Haibun, or not, as the case might be. So the work I'm doing for the past year, for example, started off with an idea. I'm going to write a series of haiku about visiting my father's grave for the first year, every week for a year after he died. But as I was writing it, Haibun started to come in, and it became necessary to start writing some Haibun. But on the other hand, then a lot of the haiku I felt were not really working as a form for what I was doing. So I ended up writing tanka, which is a substantial difference. So in other words, it was the subject and what I'm trying to express that dictated, and I use that word deliberately, dictated the form. And often I start in one form and end up thinking, this is not going to work. This form doesn't suit it. So I need to write a villanelle about this. So is that helpful to think that I don't always? And I would say one last thing. I always say I notice over many years that some writers become a short story writer or a novelist. But when I talk to novelists, they all well, not all of them, but most of them tend to write a lot of short stories that are never published. They don't even submit them, and they tend to write a lot of poetry, and they tend to be writing in lots of forms. But the public don't know about that because that's not what they see. They only see the final thing. And then you say to them, well, why do you do that? They say, well, I just like when I'm writing, not everything is going to be a novel. So I write it and I find out it's a short story because that's where it was enough.
Yeah.
It's the enough business. But I do love the Haibun form. It suits what I try to write, but I think it does. But I mean, other people might. But long answer there. Sorry. I hope
No,
it's a helpful answer.
that's good. I thought, Sean, given your form, you could go a long way on a lot longer than that. But that's good. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions. I'll start with Roman.
Thank you. Sean, lovely reading. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, to continue what you said previously, that it really depends on what you are writing. Can you maybe tell or elaborate on what themes or subjects are best covered by Haibun, except for travelogues, because it's kind of like obvious, but maybe other themes?
I think the reason it's associated with travel logs is because to this day, the greatest Haibun ever written still remains to be, in various translations, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, or whatever translation you wish, by Basho, which happens to be a travelogue. But that just happens to be the case. When you read, people often ask me about what kind of styles of prose are kind of somehow acceptable or not acceptable in a Haibun. And the answer is go back to Basho and read The Narrow Road to the Deep North. Now, obviously, people can't read it in Japanese, but the translations, I recommend reading more than one translation to try and get a handle on it. But within that, Basho is not simply writing a travelogue, number one. And number two, he's writing in a very wide variety of prose styles, sometimes incredibly direct, journalistic, and as in keeping a journal, and as in, you never hear people criticizing it's very journalistic prose. That's like a criticism of Haibun. I'm going, if it works, I would not, as a matter of principle, say you should not write in a journalistic style or a journal in either journalistic or like a journal. It doesn't matter to me personally, because of my study of Basho. It seems that Basho wrote in such a range of prose in one long Haibun that he left it wide open. He set the tone for any style of prose and also any subject to be dealt with. And so to elaborate on that, he not just wrote these very direct, we were going along and the mountain was very tall and it was steep and we met a man, didn't catch his name. And it's very direct, we couldn't find anywhere to stay. We were really hungry. But then we found this inn unexpectedly, and it's very direct. There's no flowering it up there. There's no beautifully direct, actually. And at the same time, he's famous, really lyrical, beautiful, poetic passages in it about Matsushima and so on. And all the time, there is an underlying philosophy, which he gives us from the very opening line. From memory, what's the opening line? The months and days of the travelers of eternity. Bang. And the rest of the piece is concerned with the question of eternity. It's in the first line. He's very clear all the time what his subject matter is, which is eternity. And it's very long and it goes in many directions, and it's full of characters as well, and just all kinds of descriptions. And it also took a very long time to write. The journey took 6 months, during which he was writing haiku only and notes, no prose as such. He then spent the following 2.5 years completing the rest of the journey, in which he wasn't writing The Narrow Road to the Deep North. So then it was from the beginning to the end. There's a 3-year gap between the time he started the journey, finished 6 months later, another 2.5 years before he got home. And when he got home, he took another year to actually write it all up. So he had all his haiku collected, presumably hundreds and hundreds of them. And then he started the prose, and he wrote the prose after 2.5 years after the fact. So he had a lot of time to contemplate what he was doing. This is very similar to the approach, the general approach I take. I take a long time to write something, very long time, years sometimes. So the fragmentation had pieces that were published 7 years before we went to press with it. So, and then the God of Bones is the same. There's pieces in the God of Bones that were actually published 7 years before we published. So it's, and to get to that point, to get it published, took a 2-year period. So both of the books, that my recent books, actually took 9 years each, and I'm running them in parallel and so on. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. It was about the limitations and pros and so on. Could you tell me if that satisfies your question, or have I gone off on a big tangent? Yeah, I love tangents, as you can see. So just give me an inch and I'll take a mile. But seriously, Roman, how does that go towards your question? Do you want to say something more or ask more on
It
that?
mostly tells me that there are no limitations. Like whatever would sound good, whatever would be appropriate, it fits.
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of it. However, the difficulty is that in order to write Haibun, you need to contemplate the work. In my experience, and in the experience of any Japanese writers I've worked with, but I lived in Japan for 5 years, in case people are unaware of that. And working in Japan with the Japanese led me very clearly to understand that the Haibun form requires a lot of contemplation and a lot of time. It colors the way you write, it makes it a little bit more philosophical. It also makes it more unpredictable, because in the contemplation, you write the haiku. And then you've got all these haiku, you start to work your way through the prose, and like a lot of writing, as soon as you write the first sentence, the wheels fall off, and the next sentence seems to take you somewhere unexpected, and it goes on like that. I'm very fond of it. Unfortunately, he's passed away. It was an Irish poet that I was lucky enough to hang around with for a while, especially the 80s, called Brendan Kennelly. And I remember him saying one night, writing is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as the headlamps throw, but you can drive 100 miles like that. So the process of Haibun writing is done by contemplating the journey in advance, and then getting into the car and turning the headlights on and driving at night. And we just can see what's in front of us all the time, but we do know where we're going, ultimately. Can I just mention one other thing, Daddy, because you speak Hebrew as well as Russian, don't you? Or do you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, one of my favorite expressions in the world is a 2-word expression that's very relevant to the arts, and it is yesh gevul.
Yes,
Does that
gvul.
make
Yeah,
sense to you? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Could you
Completely.
tell people
It's
what
like
roughly that means?
there is a border.
Yeah,
There is a limit.
a limit. Yeah. The Haibun form is a form and therefore has limitations. And it's the limitations that really make us work. Which is why I don't want to give the impression that it's a free-for-all, that you get into the car and drive it at night. No, you do know where you're going, just that the journey can be very unpredictable. But there are limits, and it's the limits of the Haibun that come, the requirement to write haiku within the work, that are going to make sense to the reader when they hear it. That requirement puts a lot of pressure on you as a writer. You can no longer just write away and hope for the best.
I think Shane wants to follow up on this point that you're making. Shane, are you there?
First of all, Sean, thank you. That was just a beautiful reading, very powerful. I look forward to reading the book. I haven't yet, but it's on the list. When we met to do the episode on Haibun previously, you spoke at length about, and you even mentioned a few minutes ago, the haiku come first in the process. You write the haiku, and then you have this contemplative period when you start to put together, take the drive at night and see where it leads you. Did this book follow that process rigidly, or can you think of any haiku that you found yourself reworking to pull the narrative together? In the context of as you're pulling the prose together and kind of putting it together as the overall story, were there haiku that you actually ended up reworking as part of that process, or were the haiku pretty rigid once you had them?
Oh, there's nothing rigid. The only thing that's rigid is the form itself. I can't escape the need to have, if the haiku are too clipped, too pared back, too short, when you read it aloud, it'll just sound like you had a stumble of words after a passage of prose. Or if you take it in extreme, if you try to just write 2 words as a haiku, you're finished, you know, because when you read it aloud, it's just going to fall down, you know, or people will go, sorry, was that supposed to be a poem in the middle of that? So I want to try, I should try to elaborate more. So I'm thinking about writing a story that I'm very impressed with. A boy fell into a well in Italy. This actually happened years ago, and all the world's media were focused on the boy in the well. Right? So I'm thinking of writing a Haibun about this. So I contemplate the boy in the well. Could be for weeks, could be for days, could be for months. And as I'm contemplating the situation that I'm trying to describe with the boy in the well, the dilemma of the boy in the well, the mother and the father at the top of the well, and days going by, and they finally, all that stuff. You can imagine. So I'm contemplating this, and I'm writing haiku connected to this. The haiku don't say there was a boy in the well, you know? But I'm writing what season is this in, or what's the atmosphere, what's emotionally happening with the boy in the well, and I go on and on. And the whole world is looking at the boy in the well story, and all the tensions and the emotional possibilities locally in the well, being the little boy, and the people at the top trying to rescue the boy, and all you can see the dynamics here. It's huge. I could spend months, I could spend years, and writing haiku that connect to this. Not so directly, but they connect in various ways. And I've got all these haiku. And then I start to write the story in my head. I'm thinking, will I open up with, there was a boy in a well, stuck in Italy. Is that my opening line? Or have I got to start with, you know, Mrs. Mother of the boy in the well was in her kitchen when? Or is the phone going to her? What's going to happen here? How am I going to put this together? So I'm contemplating the prose. Then I sit down. So I've got a lot of haiku literally on pages around me if this is a big story, or I might have a page at 4 or 5 haiku. And these are connected to my contemplation about what I'm now going to write about. So I start writing and it just becomes obvious after a while. Oh, I'm moving towards, or I could open with this. Look, it's there, sitting there, waiting for me. So I have one for open. Or I start writing the prose, and then it seems very clear to me that that particular haiku there is going to sit well here. And now I've got this starting to structure itself. And then after that, where am I going now? Oh, hang on. There's 2 haiku actually would go right good in a row. So, but I've got them sitting there. Just to be clear, I may rewrite the haiku a bit because now things have changed. We're in the stream of narrative. We're in the flow of this creative process. So nothing stays as it is. Now, typically I'd have anywhere between 5 and 10 haiku to write one short haibun, and I typically only use 1 or 2 haiku. So most of them get nowhere, but they're informing the process. And finally, I sometimes then have this little brainwave. It's I can hear a bird song, I can hear the curlew crying now in the bog. A haiku will emerge in the writing that has not been on the sheet. You can see how it's not that it's flexible, but it's a process. And by contemplating first and allowing haiku to emerge, that gives me some sort of firm base to be working on the haibun as a whole. Does that help? So it's not like I stick rigidly to those haiku. I often write new ones, and sometimes I write new haiku, or even what's left, which is a large amount, promotes another haibun. So I start to think about the boy in the well in Italy. Do you remember that story about the fella or the woman and the thing? And when I was a child, or something else will hit me. And some of those haiku are already, one thing leads to another, you know, that there is a connection. I don't think I've ever written a Haibun that survived on its own. That every time I finish a Haibun, there seems to be another one coming in the back of it that's prompted by this, and then another one and another one. And the way I generally work is when I've got a lot of Haibun written in what I think is a random way, then I look at them all and go, oh, I think I'm writing about loss. So then I consciously contemplate loss. And then I consciously move. That's how a team emerges. So I don't sit down and think, I'm going to write a book of Haibun and it's all about loss. I just start writing the next thing, and somebody will tap me on the shoulder sometimes. And like my publisher is very good at this. He'll read a little batch of stuff I've written and he goes, oh, I see you're writing about loss now. Oh, I didn't know that. You're right. So it's kind of a magic process. It's not a very helpful answer because it's magic.
Actually, I think it's a perfect answer, and it really informs the question that I was asking. I mean, I've had several conversations with people about how rigidly we adhere to the haiku, and like you, I tend to allow things to evolve as I, tell a story. But I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that. So thank you. Great answer. Thanks,
Shane. And I've got one from Debbie, which I feel, Debbie, this one is actually a joint question from you and me. Sean, let's talk titles. How do you come up with one? Because from my point of view, it's got to complement the haiku and the prose. But often that's really my stumbling block. How do you deal with that?
Well, I don't know where the idea that the title is important came from. It certainly didn't come from me. I don't spend a great deal of time wondering about that. And there's two approaches to titles in all literature, generally speaking, broadly speaking. A declarative title, the boy was stuck in the well, boom. Or a suggestive title, and I'll let you make up your own one about the boy in the well. So there isn't much else, you can either declare what you're writing about or you suggest what you're writing about. And there is this sort of thing I've seen repeatedly, that I've even seen people say that the title, the prose and the haiku are of equal importance. Well, that can't be true. That just can't be true. The Haibun is important. And the Haibun is the prose and the haiku plural, by the way. So that's what we're dealing with. And if you call it by some weak name, or if you just call it the Haibun I wrote yesterday, I wouldn't worry about that. I wouldn't be concerned. I very rarely take stock of titles. And this is actually an important point, because notice the language, the title, the prose, and the haiku, the singular. But who's to say there is a haiku? There could be 100 haiku might be required. Mm-hmm. There could be dozens of them. There could be sequences of them. They might be first. There might be, there's so many possibilities within Haibun that sort of neat formula of prose followed by a haiku, which I write a lot of, but it's just one way of doing it. So we have to be careful how we do it. But I don't pay much attention, even as an editor. I barely look at the title. And the last thing I like to see is a clever title. It's like, I think, just if you're going to be clever, put it in the work. So a Haibun is prose and poetry. It's a prosometric form. There's no getting away from it. They're not separate things, but the title is a separate thing. It's remember that the purpose of the title is just so we can refer to the piece of work and distinguish it from the other piece. That's the sole purpose of a title. You only put a title on it because you need to, because you've got 10 of them and you don't want to be calling them numbers 1 to 10, which people do as well. Sonnet number 14, isn't it? Sonnet number 120. So if you put numbers on it, if there's a collection, I'm happy with that. So I don't. It's nice to see it. It's nice to work on a title and all of that, but don't think it's so important personally. I wouldn't lose sleep over it. And sometimes I just go, bang, it's the boy in the well.
Okay.
If you're going to lose sleep over it, lose sleep over the Haibun itself.
Okay.
That's worth losing sleep over.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, I do read things that editors are saying, are you even do competitions, and they're saying the title, there's as much writing about the title. I just don't understand why. I'm going, it's just a title.
Okay.
I personally, I mean, I spend a certain amount of time, but not a huge amount.
Okay.
The Haibun is the important thing. I mean, if a novel has a shoddy title, you know, do you think people won't read it if it's good? You know, if a novel is really good, people say, you should read this novel. And people say, but I don't like the title. Well, I've never heard anybody say that. They kind of go, they might say it's an odd title or it's not a very good title, but no one's going to lose sleep over it. But they will lose sleep over it if you start to drift. If you're reading a novel and you're getting bored with it, and you know when you want to stop, you think, oh God, this is just too much. That's a problem. But a title is such an insignificant thing in the context of the work that I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I call it whatever you like. But why don't you all try this? Start submitting work where the title is completely irrelevant. All right, and then see if anyone notices. Because I have a suspicion that people, if you called the boy in the well story, if you called it "My dog hates her dinner," and then leave the editor to puzzle over that, you might actually get brownie points for having an absolutely kind of ambiguous title that seems to have nothing to do with what you're saying, but it must have something if the writer put it on. I'm sorry, but I'd like to have a bit of fun with the idea of submitting stuff for fun, you know, just do something wacky.
Yeah.
Don't quote me on that now.
Well, yeah, I did say
too late. It's all public.
It's all public, and there are going to be a number of editors who really don't appreciate that, probably.
But I mean, if it comes to me, I'll just have a laugh. I'll kind of scratch my head and go, I wonder why they're mentioning their dog's dietary habits when they're talking about boy in the well. But
well, in that case, we'll all have a competition to see who gets published by you and who's got the weirdest title for their piece. Marion, I think you said this is a massive revelation to me. Did you want to add anything to that?
I have actually got to the point where I've asked other people to title my Haibun. I've workshopped them and said, you know, what do you reckon? I am so bad at titles, so I'm just loving hearing that, Sean.
Can I give you a tip about something? What I do, I never start with a title for sure. As you can see, I don't have a high opinion of the value of a title. It's nice to have a catchy title or something, you know. But I mean, people are not going to dwell on the title for too long. By their nature, they're quite short. So sometimes what I do is I read the work, and sometimes there's just a good word or a good little phrase stuck in the middle of it somewhere. Like the opening piece I read today, or the one, here's a good example. How did I title the ones I read today? Let's look at that. So, come and see. The last line of the prose is, there they are, he said, come and see. So I thought, I like that. Come and see. I'll use that as the title. How simple is that? And then I thought, oh, come and...
And that's strange, Sean, because I thought you weren't really supposed to repeat something from the prose or the haiku as a title.
According to who?
I know. The people.
Oh, I've terribly bad news for the they, whoever they are. Of course you repeat.
Yeah.
I mean, how else are you going to do it? So if I'm writing about the boy in the well and the haiku mentions a well, I mean, I am writing haiku. The Haibun is a unified whole. The haiku are not the haiku are part of this. They're not. It's like saying in your fourth sentence, you should never say something that was in the second sentence, but it's okay to do it in the third sentence or some stuff like that. It's a unified piece of writing.
Yeah. And
repetition is unavoidable if you're going to be coherent. And I don't know where this comes from. I've been criticized for it. I once had this wonderful review years ago of a Haibun, and the person that wrote the review said, this Haibun by Sean O'Connor is almost perfect. Almost a perfect Haibun, which is a bit much to say about anybody's work. But anyway, we'll forgive them. But they went on to say, except for the fact that they used a particular word in the final haiku that was in the prose, And I looked at this and went, what's the problem with that? I mean, of course. So, I mean, if one of the haiku says cherry blossoms, for the sake of it, just to be cliche, I mean, of course, I got to say, I met a man as I was walking along doing a cherry blossom viewing, and the man had a cousin who was, his son was stuck in a well in Italy, which was strange because it was just on the news. This is my story. Now, I've told you, we were cherry blossom viewing. So does this mean the haiku that mentions cherry blossoms has to go in the bin, or I have to rewrite it? No. It's obviously going to be, if your haiku mentions cherry blossoms, why wouldn't you say I was at a cherry blossom viewing? It's called context. Now, I have to say that I'm always puzzled by that. Never understood it. I don't know where it goes. And it's part of this connection. It's something else I don't understand is link and shift. I mean, when I'm talking to the Japanese writers, they don't talk about this. You know, I'm thinking, why aren't they talking about it? Because when I went to Japan, I thought I understood haiku, by the way. I was even the editor of a haiku journal years before I went to Japan. I thought, oh, this is everything. I know all about this. So I was an editor and everything. Not just an editor for a while, but for 8 issues of a haiku journal. So over a period of time. And the Japanese just turned everything upside down, because I would say something and they go, why do you say that? Where'd you hear that? We've never heard of that. And so link and shift is a specific technique from the Renga.
Yeah.
And you know what they say? Link is important because there's a magic word. It has to be connected. So if you have a word in your haiku, like any word at all, and it's in your prose as well, why would it be? Because that's a link. You're not going off on a major tangent that has nothing to do. You're just not throwing a haiku in that you just feel like it. You in your own head think is connected. The poor reader has to make sense of this.
Yeah.
You got to think of the public. The reader have to understand this. So that's the link bit. But the shift, you see, when they were doing the Renga master, whoever someone was in charge. I've done this. The Renga master tells you, oh, you're doing the next one. Marion, you're up next. You're doing a 2-liner, please. 2 lines, not 3. It's number 14. Let me just look up the rule book here. Yeah. Yeah, your task is to get the autumn in there somehow and also keep the poem going, because it's one poem they're writing.
Yeah.
One poem. So, yes, the poem has been going along in various directions. So we get to verse 14 or something like that, and Marion's next. 2-liners, 7 syllables each, please. We were doing it in Japanese. And yeah, you got to mention autumn. And then you finish. And then we'll say Janice is next. So Janice, 15. That's 3 lines, minimum 575. By the way, it's not 17 syllables. It's minimum 17 syllables. Up to 23, according to Basho.
Oh.
There's another little surprise for me. But Janice is up next anyway. 3 lines. And the last one, the link, the shift was for autumn. This one is for an animal of your choice. But you've got to get an animal in there, or animals. We're flexible about this. That's difficult, you know, and the other poets are all leaning over, looking at you going, yeah, take your time now, we've all night. Because it's a high-pressure environment, it's live.
Yeah, I can
so
imagine.
you got to think on your feet and go, animals. So that's the link and shift. That's how link and shift actually works. So the shift is preordained. And I say preordained, the Renga master doesn't make it up. It's written down in advance.
Yeah.
When you get to verse 16 has to refer to something, and there's all these complicated rules. Like this verse has to refer to something from that verse, and that verse has to change the season into winter, and this one has to mention animals, and this one has to mention people that have no hair, and whatever, you know, and it goes on like that. But they have it preordained. So the shift is preordained. So in a Haibun, there is no preordained shift. So there is no shift system. Having said that, I do like when there's a sort of a shift of emphasis. I do like when it does, when it has to still connect. And sometimes I read stuff and I go, you know, I read a piece of prose, and there's a haiku at the end, and it's fascinating. But I'm thinking, what's that got to do with the prose? Seems like it just went mad. It's like they went home, they were drinking after they wrote the prose, had a hangover the next day, forgot what they were doing, and just, I better put a haiku in the end of that. There's a nice haiku. And they wrote a lovely haiku and just put it on arbitrarily, regardless of anything. That's not quite what we mean by linked and shift. So the link is the bit that insists that, yes, we do have to use words in both. Now, if you're trying to get published by editors who don't agree with that, well, I do it all the time, folks. I mean, the difficulty is that there isn't enough emphasis on going back to the basics and what is this very old form and how does it work? And all kinds of people are throwing out ideas all the time and they kind of stick for a while, but it's reinventing the wheel, really. And when you stop and think about what are we trying to achieve, well, one thing we do need is that readers will understand what we're saying, and it'll have plausibility. All work in literature has to be plausible. Even science fiction has to be plausible. But the plausibility is not that. If you say in a science fiction piece that, or I'll tell you something else. If you say my character is a man who's a 40-year-old accountant and he works in a small accountancy office, this is my character, and his hobby is skateboarding, straight away you're going, well, that's not very plausible, is it? Not very likely. So then you've got to make it plausible. So what you've now said is my character is an eccentric accountant, a different accountant, an unusual accountant. So that then sets the tone for, well, how do the other accountants in the office relate to that person? Well, the answer will be not the same way as they relate to each other, because they are golfers, rugby players, cliche people. All the cliches will be there. So once you take a single step as a writer and say something, no matter what you say, the plausibility is about the fact that you stay online and that you don't forget what you said, and don't have your characters change age suddenly, or don't forget that it's a teenager you're talking about that cannot also be an astronaut. You can't have them reading the news that night because you said they were 14. So the plausibility has to stay there. And for plausibility to happen, the haiku and the prose have to be connected very clearly. They have to work as a coherent package. And I would finish this by saying the difficulty is that we often talk about the prose in a Haibun and then the haiku. And really that binary thing called prose and haiku has its dangers, because we could forget that no, it's actually a thing called a Haibun. It's not components. It's almost like talking about a car. And I don't know about car engines. You know, if people say, well, how's the gearbox or the carburetor? You know, and you go, and I'm just going, does it have an engine? Let's talk about the engine. Does the engine work? And I go, yeah, but the gearbox. You have to get the gearbox right. I go, I don't know about gearboxes. Just give me the engine. You know, we want that. You know, so that's the danger I see with the prose and haiku kind of dichotomy. They are one unified thing, and they are beautiful when they are unified.
Has anyone got a pressing question? Janice, over to you.
I have a question about intention. And in the Zuihitsu section of fragmentation, it seemed like random stream of consciousness the first time that I read fragmentation. But I started to read it again this morning, and I could see connection between each piece of the Zuihitsu and the Haibun. And so my question is, what relationship did you intend between the Haibun and the Zuihitsu?
The same intention I have between the entire piece. So sometimes people say to me, oh, I enjoyed your collection, this collection of Haibun, or whatever it is, and fragmentation, and they refer to God of Bones as a collection. in my mind, they're not collections. They are consciously written pieces of work that, in my mind, are about something and are saying something in a unified way, even though it may be coming from a myriad directions. So I refer to them as a book, my book, this book and that book, not that collection. A collection is a series of work written and published that are all independent of each other, and then you collect them together. So in the Zuihitsu, the 3 pieces of Zuihitsu in the book Fragmentation, I was very aware that those Zuihitsu are part of this big picture, and all the pieces. I write them on their own, but they are in the context of a bigger piece of work. And I'm definitely working thematically, and I'm working systematically right through. So everything is connected. And one of the questions I have to ask myself when I'm finished is what remains in the work? What has remained relevant? Certain pieces become less relevant as you go along, and some pieces take on an unexpected relevance. So the final act is then to try and curate this from beginning to end in a way that is coherent. So glad you're seeing a connection between the Zuihitsu and the rest, because it is definitely not accidental. And I find Zuihitsu incredibly difficult to write, because while they have the appearance of being haphazard, I find they take a lot of contemplation, and I'm very slow to put pen to paper. I will spend considerable periods of time mulling over a Zuihitsu approach. And then when I sit down, it looks random, but it has a kind of inner coherence, or that's what we're hoping for. Now, I don't know, you read it, and the first time you didn't see it. So that tells us something that is not obviously, but I don't do obvious either. I just speak obviously, but when I'm writing, I try not to write obviously. It's a bit like making the accountant a skateboarder. That fit becomes difficult once you take that step. And going into the Zuihitsu world is a tricky business, because it's a very tricky thing. They're very, very tricky. It's a very tricky form to write in. And it's interesting that in Japan, novelists all talk about Zuihitsu as something that is something they've all tried and really don't have the, it's a very, they all say it's so hard to get your head around this disparate piece of writing that has to have some internal coherence. That's the tricky bit. You know, a lot of people say to me, but you're just following the brush, you're just writing what comes to your mind. And you're going, oh, you don't want to do that now without dipping the brush into the ink for a long time. And they literally used to make the ink and all of that. That's all part of the process. It's a long contemplation, and then it's almost like revealing a kind of weird meditation. It's almost like that, but it must have coherence for the readers, or it won't. If you just write, if I wrote down my random thoughts, believe me, you'd lose interest very, very quickly. I'd say it'd get about 1 page, but the Zuihitsu is not quite like that. It's a lot more.
I think it's time to wrap up, and I want to say thank you very much, Sean, for staying on and doing the questions, and to thank you all my lovely guests who've come along today to help me experiment with this live event. I hope you all enjoyed it, and to everyone who's listening, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and come back and visit us again, as I'm sure Sean will be, because God of Bones will be up soon. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to see everybody.
Well, we need to wrap up now. Thank you again to Sean O'Connor and to our lovely audience of poets for coming along to P Towers today. Thank you for listening at home. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I did. And remember, the links to Sean's books will be in the show notes. So until we meet again, keep writing.